Clara Dunmore had never seen the Great Plains before the train dropped her at the edge of them. She was 22 years old, with a small leather trunk, a church dress that had seen better years, and a letter folded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. The letter promised her a home. It promised her a husband, a man named Gerald Holt, who described himself as a successful rancher with a kind heart and steady hands. Clara had believed every word. She had no reason not to. Back in Ohio, she had nothing left. Her father was dead. Her mother had remarried a man who made it clear that Clara was an extra mouth and an unwelcome one. So when she had seen the advertisement in the back of a church pamphlet, a rancher in the Dakota Territory seeking a wife of good character, she had written back the same evening by candlelight, with her best handwriting. The reply came 3 weeks later. Gerald Holt was charming on paper. He described sunsets over rolling grassland. He wrote about a house he had built with his own hands, with a proper kitchen and a window that faced east so she would see the sunrise every morning. He said he was a God-fearing man who wanted a partner, not a servant. Clara had read that line twice. A partner, not a servant. She had tucked the letter under her pillow and decided. But the man who met her at the station was nothing like his words. Gerald Holt was tall, yes, and he had the rancher's sun-darkened skin and the calloused hands he had mentioned. But his eyes were cold in a way that no letter could have warned her about. He looked her over like she was livestock at a fair, checking her teeth might have come next and she would not have been surprised. He said nothing warm. He said, "You're thinner than I expected," and then he picked up her trunk and carried it to a wagon without asking if she needed help herself. The ride to his property took nearly 2 hours. Clara spent most of it watching the land roll past in waves of dry grass and trying to find something beautiful in it. She almost managed it once, when a hawk cut low across the sky and disappeared into the gold of the late afternoon. But Gerald said nothing the entire ride. He chewed tobacco and flicked the reins and kept his eyes on the trail like she wasn't there at all. The house was not what he had described. It was a low, dark structure of rough timber with a door that hung crooked on its hinges. The kitchen window did face east, that part was true. But the glass was cracked and cold air pushed through the gap like a slow, steady whisper. There were 2 ranch hands who lived in a shed nearby. They glanced at Clara when she stepped down from the wagon but quickly looked away, and there was something in their avoidance that sent a chill straight through her. That first night, Gerald made the rules clear. She would cook, clean, and do what she was told. He did not ask for her opinion on anything. When she tried to speak, he talked over her like she had not made a sound. She lay awake in the dark that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, and understood with perfect clarity that she had made a terrible mistake. She was hundreds of miles from anyone who knew her name. She had spent her last savings on the train ticket. She had signed her name to a contract that a church deacon had witnessed back in Ohio. A contract that, out here, seemed to mean whatever Gerald Holt decided it meant. By the end of the first week, Clara knew she had to leave. The question was not whether, but how. Gerald kept the wagon keys on a chain at his belt. The nearest town was 12 miles south. She had no money, no horse of her own, and no map. But she was not the kind of woman who waited for rescue. She began to plan with the same quiet determination that had written that first letter by candlelight. She watched Gerald's routines. She noted the time he rose, the time he rode out to the far pasture, the window of 2 hours every Tuesday when she was truly alone. She would need those 2 hours. She began saving small pieces of food in a cloth bag behind the loose stone beneath the kitchen hearth. She would need to eat. She would need to walk. And she would walk, if it came to that, every one of those 12 miles, even through snow. Tuesday came with a sky the color of pewter and a wind that had teeth. Clara woke before dawn and lay still, listening to Gerald's heavy breathing until it settled into the slow rhythm of deep sleep. Then she moved. She had planned every step of this moment for 5 days. She knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which were safe. She knew the back door latch could be lifted without a sound if you pressed inward on the door first, taking the weight off the metal. She had practiced it 3 times during the day when no one was watching. She was ready. She dressed in 2 layers, stuffed her cloth bag of food inside her coat, and wrapped her feet in extra wool before pulling on her boots. She left the church dress on the hook. She did not need it. She took nothing of his and left nothing that would explain where she had gone, because she genuinely did not know where she was going. South toward town. That was the plan. Stay near the trail but off it in case he came riding. Keep moving. Do not stop. The cold hit her the moment she stepped outside. It was the kind of cold that makes your face ache after the first minute, that turns your breath into clouds and makes the inside of your nose sting. But Clara put her head down and walked. The prairie stretched out in every direction, vast and gray and utterly indifferent to her. She had grown up near trees, near hills, near fences that told you where one thing ended and another began. Out here there were no fences. The land just went on. It was terrifying and, in a strange way, freeing. She made good time for the first hour. The trail was visible as a slightly darker line through the frozen grass, and she kept it 30 yards to her right, walking parallel. Her feet were cold but not numb. She ate a piece of dry cornbread from the bag and kept moving. The sun came up slowly, dragging itself over the horizon like it too was reluctant to face the cold, and the gray sky turned a pale, watery gold. It was during that second hour that she heard the horse. Her heart stopped. She dropped to one knee in the grass, making herself small, and looked back toward the ranch. There was a rider, far back, moving at a canter. She could not yet tell if it was Gerald, but there was no one else it could be. He had woken earlier than usual. Maybe he had heard her. Maybe one of the ranch hands had seen her leave. It did not matter. She was out in the open with nowhere to hide, and a man on horseback could cover ground in minutes that had taken her an hour on foot. She ran. There was no strategy to it anymore. It was pure instinct, the body doing what it had to do. She ran through the grass with her skirts bunched in her fists and her bag banging against her ribs and the cold air burning her throat. She ran east, away from the trail, away from the rider, toward a line of low brush and rock that she could see maybe half a mile ahead. If she could reach it, she could hide. She could at least try. Her lungs were screaming. Her legs were heavy. She was not a woman accustomed to running. She did not make it to the rocks. She tripped on a frozen rut hidden beneath the grass and went down hard on her hands and knees. She scrambled up immediately, but the fall had cost her momentum and precious seconds, and when she looked back, the rider was close enough now for her to see the color of his coat. Gray. Gerald's coat was gray. Then something unexpected happened. From the east, the direction she had been running, there were other riders. Not one, but 4, emerging from the far side of the brush line at a steady walk. They were Lakota. She knew that immediately from their dress and the way they sat their horses. She felt a different kind of fear replace the one she had been carrying. Everything she had ever heard about Native people had been shaped by men like Gerald Holt, and none of it was kind. But the rider in front raised one hand, a flat, open palm gesture, and his eyes were not on her with the look of a hunter. They were on her with the look of a man who has just seen something that surprised him. Gerald pulled his horse up about 40 yards back. He shouted something. Clara stood in the frozen grass between two groups of people, her chest heaving, and she did not know which way to run. So she stopped running. She stood straight, planted her feet, and waited to see what the world would do next. His name was Chayton, which meant falcon in the Lakota language. He was not a young man, perhaps 40, with the kind of face that has been shaped by weather and time into something that looks carved rather than grown. He sat his black horse with the easy stillness of a man who has been riding since before he could walk. He had seen the woman fall. He had seen her scramble back to her feet. And he had seen the rider behind her slow down when he saw the 4 of them appear. Chayton understood what he was looking at. He had a sister. He had a mother. He knew the difference between a woman running toward something and a woman running away. Gerald Holt called out from his position 40 yards back. His voice carried the particular tone of a man trying to sound calm while being anything but. He said the woman was his wife, that she was unwell, that he was taking her home. He said it loudly enough for everyone to hear, and he sat his horse without moving closer, because 4 Lakota riders between him and his destination was a calculation he was making very carefully. Chayton did not answer immediately. He walked his horse forward slowly until he was within a few yards of Clara. He looked at her. Not at her clothing or her luggage. At her face. Clara met his eyes because she had nothing left to lose by being honest, and honesty was easier than fear at this particular moment. She shook her head once clearly. A simple, unambiguous signal. No. He is not taking me anywhere. What happened in Chayton's mind during the next few seconds was the product of everything he was. He was a chief, which meant his decisions carried weight beyond his own life. Involving himself in a dispute between white settlers was dangerous. The year was 1878, and the relationship between his people and the United States government was a wound that kept being reopened. Every conflict, every incident, was used as justification for something worse. His 3 companions were watching him. Gerald Holt was watching him. Clara was watching him, though she was trying not to show how desperate her watching was. Chayton made his decision. He spoke to Gerald in English, which he had learned in pieces over years of necessary contact with traders and soldiers and government men. His English was deliberate and precise, because he had learned it as a tool rather than a comfort. He said clearly, "This woman does not wish to go with you." Simple words. Enormous weight. Gerald's composure cracked a little. He said she was his wife, that she had signed a contract, that they had no business interfering in a legal arrangement. He reached for the language of law and property because those were the tools white men in his position used when they wanted to make a thing sound like it was already settled. Chayton said, "A signature is not a chain." He said it without raising his voice. He said it the way a man says something that he has already decided is the last word on the matter. The standoff that followed was the kind that exists mostly in the nervous systems of the people involved. Gerald weighed his options. He was one man on a horse. Chayton and his 3 companions were 4 men on horses. And Chayton sat there as if he had nowhere else to be, as if time was something he had plenty of and Gerald was welcome to stand there in the cold until he came to his senses. It was a masterful kind of courage. Not the loud kind, not the violent kind, but the steady, immovable kind that is far more difficult to argue with. Clara, meanwhile, was still standing in the grass between them, and she became aware that her legs were shaking, not from cold but from the release of 5 days of concentrated dread. She was afraid to move in case any movement was interpreted as the wrong kind. But then one of Chayton's companions, a younger man, stepped his horse sideways until it was beside her, creating a physical barrier between her and Gerald. It was done quietly, without drama, but the meaning was clear to everyone present. Gerald sat there for a long time. Long enough for the cold to settle deeper. Long enough for the calculation to run through every possible outcome. Then he pulled his horse around and rode back the way he came without another word. Clara watched him until he was a small gray shape against the pale sky, and then she pressed her hands over her mouth to keep the sound inside her chest from escaping into the cold air. Chayton's camp was 3 miles east, tucked into a bend of frozen creek where the cottonwood trees broke the wind and the ground was solid enough for winter sheltering. He did not immediately invite Clara there. Instead, once Gerald was out of sight, Chayton simply turned his horse east and rode at a walk. His 3 companions did the same. Clara stood in the grass for a moment, understanding that she had been left a choice. She could follow or she could stand here alone on the open prairie with 12 miles still between her and the nearest town. She followed. No one spoke for the first mile. Clara matched the pace of the horses as best she could on foot, and after a few minutes one of the younger riders, the same one who had positioned his horse beside her, dismounted and gestured for her to take the horse. She understood the offer even without shared language and shook her head. The young man put a hand on his chest and said a word she did not understand, then simply held out the reins again. She took them. It was not weakness. It was the acceptance of help from someone offering it sincerely, and that alone was enough to make her eyes sting. The camp held perhaps 30 people. Clara felt their eyes on her the moment she arrived, the natural attention given to an unexpected stranger, but no one moved toward her with anything that felt like hostility. A woman about Clara's age came forward immediately and guided her to a fire without needing to speak any shared language. She brought food, a thick stew with meat and roots in it, served in a clay bowl that had been warming at the fire's edge. Clara ate it with both hands around the bowl and felt the heat of it travel all the way down through her cold chest. Over the following hours, in fragments of broken English and the universal language of gesture and expression, Clara understood that Chayton's band was in a difficult position of their own. They had been pressed steadily off their traditional hunting grounds. The winter had been hard. They were moving carefully through territory where every step risked a confrontation with soldiers enforcing boundaries that kept being redrawn without their consent. They had their own enormous struggles, and yet Chayton had stopped on a frozen prairie to stand between a stranger and the man threatening her. Clara thought about that a long time sitting by the fire. Chayton himself came and sat across the fire from her that evening. His wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Winona who had the kind of quiet authority that needs no introduction, sat beside him. Chayton's English was careful and limited but workable. He told Clara that in the morning, one of his men would take her to the town. Not all the way, it was not safe for them to ride openly into a white settlement, but close enough that she could walk the rest without difficulty. He told her this plainly, as if it was simply what would happen and there was no reason to make a ceremony of it. Clara asked him why he had intervened. She had been thinking about this question all afternoon and needed to ask it, because the answer mattered to her in a way she could not quite explain. Chayton looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, in his careful English, that a person running away is easy to read. He said his people knew something about being forced into places they did not choose. He said he did not need to understand every detail of a situation to understand the part that was wrong. Clara held that answer carefully, the way you hold something small and important. Winona brought her a blanket that night, a real one, heavy and warm, smelling of wood smoke and something earthy she could not name. Clara slept beside the fire in the shelter of a temporary structure that the women had arranged quickly, efficiently, without any need for discussion. She was warm for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood branches with a sound like breathing, and the prairie, which had seemed so merciless that morning, felt strangely inhabited and alive. She thought of Ohio. She thought of the candlelit letter, the hope she had packed into that small leather trunk along with her good dress. She thought of Gerald's cold eyes at the station. And she thought of Chayton's open palm raised against the gray sky, a simple gesture that had divided one world from another as cleanly as a blade. She fell asleep before she could finish the thought, and she did not dream of anything frightening. The young rider who had offered her his horse was named Luda. She learned this the next morning when he brought 2 horses to the edge of camp and pointed south with a questioning look. She nodded. He nodded. They rode out into a morning that had broken clear and sharp, the sky a hard, brilliant blue, the frost on the grass sparkling in the early light like the land had been remade overnight into something worth looking at. Luda left her at the top of a low ridge from which the town was clearly visible, a cluster of dark structures against the winter-pale land, close enough to make out the line of a main street and the shape of a church steeple. He pointed, looked at her to confirm she understood, and then pulled his horse around without ceremony. Clara watched him ride back the way they had come until the ridge swallowed him, and then she stood alone at the top of that hill and looked at the town below. She was not the same woman who had stepped off the train 10 days ago. That woman had carried a folded letter and a set of beliefs about the world that had proved, one by one, to be made of paper. This woman carried nothing but a cloth bag with the last heel of cornbread, a borrowed blanket tied across her back, and something harder and quieter that had grown in the place where her fear had been. She was not hopeful in the easy, unexamined way she had been before. She was something better, clear. She walked down the ridge and into town and went to the first establishment with women in it, a dry goods store run by a woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who took one look at Clara's face and the state of her boots and asked no questions that weren't necessary. Clara explained what she needed: work, a room, and a way to send a letter east. Mrs. Hartwell nodded at each item as if it was a perfectly reasonable shopping list and said she had a back room above the store, that she needed help with the accounts as it happened, and that the post rider came through on Thursdays. It was as simple and as difficult as that. Clara began to build her life from that back room above the store, the way you build anything solid, one thing at a time, without rushing, without pretending the foundation is stronger than it is. She was good at the accounts. She had a quick mind for numbers that her father had always praised and no one since had thought to use. Mrs. Hartwell paid her fairly and did not treat her as a lesser thing, and that alone was enough to work with. She wrote to Gerald Holt once, a single letter, through a lawyer in the territorial capital whose name Mrs. Hartwell provided. The letter was brief. It stated that she would not be returning, that she did not consider their arrangement valid under any definition of the word, and that if he chose to pursue the matter legally she would describe in detail to whoever would listen, exactly what kind of man he was. She never received a reply. She had not expected one. Some men, when they understand that a woman is not afraid of them anymore, simply find it easier to pretend she never existed. Clara thought about Chayton often in the months that followed. She thought about the specific quality of his courage, the way it had been exercised not through force but through a kind of immovable calm, a willingness to stand in an uncomfortable place and not move until the right thing happened. She had read, in a newspaper that came through the store, about the continued pressures on the Lakota people, the broken treaties, the relentless push further onto land that kept shrinking. She felt the weight of that knowledge. She was alive and building something because a man with enormous problems of his own had stopped to care about hers. She did not know how to repay that. She wasn't sure repayment was the right word for it. What she knew was that it had changed the architecture of how she thought about people. She had grown up being told who was dangerous and who was safe, who deserved help and who didn't, and the world had organized itself in her mind along the lines those stories drew. Chayton had, in one quiet, cold morning on the prairie, redrawn all of them. When spring came, Clara had saved enough to buy a small interest in the dry goods store. By summer, her name was on the sign. She hired 2 women who needed work, one of whom had arrived on a train from the east with a letter folded soft at the creases and a story that Clara recognized immediately. She gave that woman the back room, taught her the accounts, and on the woman's 3rd day, when she seemed steadier, Clara told her what had happened on the frozen prairie. Not as a story of rescue but as a story about what people are capable of when they decide to be. The woman listened. When Clara was done, the woman was quiet for a moment and then said, "I didn't know people like that existed." Clara looked out the east-facing window of the store at the wide, flat light of the Dakota morning, at the land that had nearly swallowed her and then, unexpectedly, delivered her. "They do," she said. "You just have to end up in the right place to meet them." She did not say it was easy to find such people. She did not say the world was fair or that things worked out the way they should. She said only what she knew to be true from the evidence of her own life, spoken in a back room above a dry goods store on the edge of the Great Plains, where a woman who had once been afraid of everything was now afraid of almost nothing at all.